As the thunderstorm began to wind down, a man who looked about in his mid-20s and wearing only pajama pants stood out on his balcony, looking around the darkened city. He swore he had heard something far out from somewhere out in the city, but there was nothing he could see. That was probably what his mind wanted him to think. He took in a deep breath through his nose as he raised his head more to stare through the now light drizzle, swearing he saw a dark blue body with large black wings flying across the sky, red eyes glowing through her dark, multicolored mane. Obviously, there was nothing there like the man had expected, minus him. No Wendigo cross pony hybrid with a knack for telling horror stories around a campfire in the dark forest that night. Ugh, maybe I'm just letting this whole urban legend business get to me. Look at you, best detective in the world, and yet you're freaked out of your mind by some dumbass urban legend that dumb kids tell each other in order to cover what dumb shit they do in the woods at night. And the horrible shit committed against poor Juliet Studios, then the crime she later committed. He struggled to suppress a shudder at the headline he had received on his desk one morning, long before the urban legend started, detailing the famous studio head's murder and her daughter's disappearance from the town about a week after the actual accident. But it crept up anyhow. Probably because the details of the case were disturbing, to say the least. The actual investigation wasn't much better, as he had to inspect the body from all angles to try to find the cause of death. It was a nasty job, to be sure, more nasty than any other body he had to inspect, especially considering the state of it when it was discovered. It was difficult to properly identify the exact cause of death, given how utterly defiled the body was. But he somehow managed to find stab wounds, no doubt made from a knife on random parts of the woman's body. And that was only if he could identify which parts of her body weren't ripped apart by what seemed like teeth and hands. So, obviously her death was caused by stabbing before whatever monstrosity she created, according to the locals who found her, and the ones telling the urban legend, had its way with her. Once confirming the cause of death, he then examined the bloody foot/hoof prints going from the body up the basement stairs, then strangely towards a roof window in the studio, the shattered glass still left on the ground. Of course, there was a lot of confusion between both the detective and the police, as this was a rather unusual method of escape for this murderer. Yeah, he had seen cases where the murderer would jump out a window whenever the front door was out of order. But that was only the first story or second story, if they were that desperate to escape, 'cause any higher than that would spell disaster. Never a frickin' top studio window, which would be hard to reach without the impossible ability to fly, or impressive tools to scale the walls for a good grip. However, there were no scrapes in the walls or stuff like that would indicate any damage was made. There was only the broken window, the oddly shaped footprints, and the witnesses to the crime. At first, he dismissed the possibility, as the Wendigo legend was nothing more than a myth, and it could be possible that the locals were on some serious drugs when they discovered the body in the basement. However, it didn't add up with the evidence he had examined, especially the hoof prints. It didn't exactly look like the entire thing was staged, for the body was slowly rotting with time, and the blood, when tested, was indeed real and belonged to the dead woman when comparing her last blood sample to the most recent. A murder had taken place in this movie studio, obviously, but what happened afterwards was not something he wanted to accept, or possibly was something he needed to process properly before he could accept the truth, 'cause it was absolutely insane. Since he wasn't going to deal with the aftermath, he investigated the details that led up to the murder. The local doctors got started on an autopsy right away upon the body being delivered back to them, while both he and the town's police rushed around, conducting interviews with the locals to fill out the whole story. Every local they asked told the same story about there living a girl named Amanda Studios in this town, along with her mother and the exact same one he was currently investigating. Now, he wasn't exactly sure till he got his hands on some pictures in the pair's shared home/studio, but he was certain that the woman murdered, though it was difficult to tell since the body was ripped apart till her identity was nearly unrecognizable, was the studio head, Juliet Studios. Okay, so he figured out who was the victim, but not her killer, though he did have an idea of who it was, and that was somehow even more terrifying than the disgusting details so far. Obviously, he tried to shake his head free of these thoughts, 'cause there was no way that happened. There was no way a small, skinny 10-year-old girl could take down a grown woman with just her strength. Could she? Well, he didn't think so, but he needed more evidence before he made a decision, or something of that sort. So, he and the police went back and interviewed the same people about Amanda Studios, more in detail. The answers he got ranged from the girl being cheerful, geeky, to her suddenly becoming cold and unfeeling after returning from the hospital after an accident. An accident? He asked himself, stroking his chin in thought when he heard the rather interesting words, for in his mind they had some kind of connection to the murder, or at least he believed they did. So, he asked for the spicy details of what this accident was. However, most of the locals didn't know, as it was done behind closed doors. The doctors and some of the studio members managed to have what he was searching for. A little, but still. From what he gathered as best as he could, Amanda was simply hanging out at the studio, minding her own business, till she got called back to a back room by Juliet. Then a knife was stabbed into the younger girl's spine, possibly to try to kill her, according to the doctors who examined her wound. Upon hearing this part and seeing the images of Amanda's back, the detective felt anger rise in his chest at the victim for what she did. If Amanda was truly Juliet's murderer, then he could understand why she killed her own mother. But still, he needed the full story before jumping to conclusions. So, he kept asking around. What he gathered after Amanda's almost stabbing, the girl in question became cold, aggressive, and mistrustful of others. Not surprising given what she suffered. When he asked if the child had tried to tell higher authorities, there were several winces from the others that told him all the answers he needed. He didn't think it was possible for his rage to rise, but it was slowly doing just that, and what was said next nearly broke the camel's back. An actual employee of the studio had seen Juliet with a motherfucking knife, and hadn't reported the bitch to the police until a murder suddenly occurred. As he listened to the local stories, he nearly felt his brain explode, and he needed to take a longer lunch break than usual, just so he could properly process this information while downing at least 6 cups of warm coffee. A lot more than he usually would have. Honestly, he wasn't entirely sure how much coffee he drank, as everything was a blur, but that hardly mattered, as the coffee took his mind off the current situation. Well, almost, as he remembered thinking, well, I could completely understand why Amanda lost it and became so untrusting. I probably would be the same way if the same thing happened to me. A hand went from the coffee cup to his face, covering half of it in exasperation and stress, not just from the situation, but almost the contents of the case he was working on. He was now questioning his decision on taking on this case. Once returning back from his probably 2-hour coffee lunch break, he got straight back into work. He searched through the crowd of unemployed studio workers till he found the only witness to Juliet's supposed intervention, later turned murder, a man who worked with the director as well as the studio actors. His name was David Anderson. Interviewing the man in a one-on-one, The detective wasn't sure what to expect, but he was surprised to learn the director's assistant wasn't blind to the strange goings-on at the studio, mostly Amanda's behavior. He supposed that it would be hard to be blind to your surroundings when it was changing so quickly in the strangest ways, especially when you were close to your boss and their family. With that knowledge in mind, David went on to explain that he had always felt odd around his boss and her daughter after Amanda's return from the hospital. He wasn't sure why he felt this way, but there was this air about Juliet. Almost like she had committed a truly terrible crime that she didn't want anyone to know about. And based on the aggressive behavior Amanda displayed, the odd air he got around the lead head of the studio became even odder. However, David didn't go to the police, feeling like they wouldn't believe him if he didn't give them some kind of proof. So he spent most of his time at the studio, gathering whatever evidence he could on both Juliet and Amanda's studios. Even though he felt like he was doing a good job with that, David didn't feel like it was enough to fully get the dirt on Juliet. He needed more, or rather, a full confirmation that the studio head was up to something no good. And on the night nearing the murder, he had gotten his wish when he overheard Juliet telling another worker of the studio that she was going to hold an intervention for her daughter one night. Bingo! The breakthrough he needed. As David finished his sentence, the detective had to excuse himself from David's living room to make another coffee, as he was craving coffee like he usually did whenever he was doing a case such as this. Of course, he asked David if he could use his coffee machine to make it. David agreed and decided he wanted one. Once both men were fully seated, coffee in hand, David went back to explaining that after he overheard this, he felt like a kid on Christmas. Yet despite this, he didn't let his excitement show, otherwise he would get confused gazes and questions coming his way, though in hindsight, David did admit he wished he had told someone about his suspicions, 'cause then he could have had more backup in case something went wrong. The detective didn't do anything more than nod and took a sip of his coffee, listening to the story with barely any interest, almost fully knowing where this was going. However, David frowned very hard as he took another long sip of his coffee, tapping his fingers on his mug as he continued, explaining that he never got to expose Juliet for the vile monster she was, for at his other job, he had gotten a serious injury and fell into a coma for 2 weeks, just as the infamous murder and possible but not confirmed transformation. David didn't mention what the injury was, but a look at the guy's hospital records all confirmed just how bad the injury was. In the 3rd week, he woke up, but had to stay in the hospital so he could properly heal. 2 days after Dave had woken up, he was simply relaxing in his room, when he suddenly ran across that news article and all went to hell from there. Concluding his interview with David Anderson, the detective finished his cup of coffee and went back to his motel room where he added the information to his report, along with the information he had gotten earlier in the day. As he sat in silence, scratching at the paper with his pencil, he had shivers running down his spine as he managed to piece together the whole story, even with it being told out of order. Even confirming Juliet's murderer in his own head, Amanda Studios. Even if he didn't want to admit it out loud, the evidence was pointing towards her. There was no one else within the studio besides Amanda and her supposed mother. Plus, the footprints were far too small to be anyone else. Well, they could have been his younger daughter, Mindy Wilson, but he knew her better than that. Mindy was never the type who would resort to violence unless she really needed to, and there were very, very few times where Mindy had to get physical with the bullies at the town's school, minus that time where he heard about a fight between 2 girls in an old factory or something like that. He couldn't exactly remember the details right now, but they didn't really matter right now either. The only thing that did was the confirmation of the young murderer, something that made him sag. Young murderers were rare, but not unheard of, and were always the tragic cases he had to work on. It was sad to hear about children in really horrible situations resorting to murder because they didn't want to be hurt again. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them. It was one of the reasons he became a PI and child psychiatrist, as well as tried to be the best, not perfect, father ever to Mindy, Marcus, and his recent son-in-law, Leonardo Dennis, the latter of which was slowly inheriting his last name. It wasn't only to remove innocent children from abusive situations, but also help them recover and get them on the better path to a new and brighter life, like what he had done with Leonardo when the boy in question stumbled into his house on a dark, rainy night, and that was what he was going to do for Amanda. He sighed heavily as he buried his face into his hands once again, barely flinching at the cold breeze that passed over the hotel room's balcony, for he was more focused on his own failure. For Pete's sakes, why didn't I suspect something suspicious when Mindy first told me about Amanda? Maybe I could have done something to stop this shitstorm. Despite him being the best at both his jobs, there was only so much he could physically do for the people. Sometimes, the very best isn't enough. You can try as much as you can, but sometimes it isn't enough. Well, ain't much I can do for her now besides try to find her and put a stop to Amanda's continued downward spiral into madness. It's not going to be easy, but then, when is anything in this world any bit easy? With a final sigh, the man turned around and headed back inside his hotel room, shutting the door behind him. Unknown to the man, the body left in the hospital twitched. It was slight, so no one noticed at first. The body twitched more. What the fuck? His footsteps echoed in the hall as he took a few steps backwards due to shock. He took in a deep breath as he walked back to the body. It was dark in the grave room where he was working as he was finishing up for the night, but he was just about able to make out pure white fur running along some parts of the body. What the? The doctor squinted his eyes closer, barely making out the bony arm that was slowly transforming into a hoof. His hand touched the bear's skin, which sent shivers down his spine, both from contact and the feeling. It didn't feel like skin anymore, but more like fur, and were those stitches? His hands moved to her hair, swearing he saw colors of pink, green, blue, and stars? The body twitched once more, then moved, forehooves resting on the table as it pushed itself up, wings spread out, horns sparkling with magic as it came to life. Once lifeless sockets reopened, eyes that were once brown flickered blue-green and light purple, teeth sharpening, becoming fangs. Antlers burst out from its skull, light yellow and blue-green magic sparkling across them as it finally turned to the doctor, bared its fangs, and pounced.